I will turn to Bob Semple. Make the point here that transparency and information and the importance of sharing and accessing information is not just an issue for the public sector, for the Ombudsman or for the Minister. It's also an issue for the private sector. The Minister alluded to earlier on the need to protect whistleblowers both in the public and private sector, and it's an issue we've been campaigning on for some time now. Bob, I'll ask you just to share your thoughts on the importance of information in good governance in the private sector.
Thank you, John. Minister, Ombudsman, ladies and gentlemen, I have a confession to make. I've been involved in fraud for over 30 years. Well, in the investigation anyway. And in responding tonight to John's kind invitation to take a broader picture of fraud and the role that Speaking Up has, I reflected really on the range of frauds that I've seen over my professional career in over 30 years. And if there's one thing I've learned over all the years, it is, in fact, never to be surprised, because there's an awful lot more fraud and wrongdoing going on than probably any of us is prepared to admit. And it's on the small scale and it's on the major scale. So what I thought I'd do is maybe just try to broaden the focus of the theme this evening to looking at not just the public but private sector as well, and really to focus in on three things. First of all, how big is the problem? Secondly, who should be concerned about it, doing something about it? And thirdly, when? Last year I had the very enjoyable experience of working with An Garda Síochána on an updated publication of Fraud Alert, which took a careful look at some of these issues. But more particularly, I was interested in some of the psychology behind why wrongdoing happens. Some of you may be familiar with the infamous Stanford prison experiment conducted some decades ago by a professor of psychology called Philip Zimbardo. He took 24 of his psychology students, split them into two groups, and one group became the wardens and the other group became the prisoners. And he then put them into a mock jail. And he wanted to see what would happen. And the experiment went terribly wrong in only 3 or 4 days. One of the students nearly had a nervous breakdown. All the students, and these were all classmates, but all the students acting as wardens within a couple of days started to beat up their colleagues who were the prisoners. And all of the prisoners started to protest violently. And Zimbardo was fascinated. Why did this happen? What was going on with very intelligent young men who, when put in this situation, turned to a particular type? And he spent most of his career examining this. Published a very interesting book recently called The Lucifer Effect, on why evil happens. He was the one who gave expert testimony, for example, on the Abu Ghraib misuse a couple of years ago. And what he has concluded after decades of research is this: that about 10% of us are probably good to the heart, and about 10% of us are probably bad to the heart, and about 80% of us are in the middle somewhere, capable of leaning towards good or evil. And in particular, he identifies a whole series of steps, of situations, or of factors that grease the slippery slopes towards evil. So he talks about, for example, mindlessly taking the first step, about groupthink, and we heard a bit of reference to that in recent reports, about anonymization or dehumanization, of separating ourselves from the situation in which we find ourselves. And all of these are really important insights, in my view, into thinking about how susceptible not everyone out there is to wrongdoing or fraud, but how we all are susceptible to taking the wrong decision at a particular point in time. And it might be small or it might be large. The most recent research from Harvard underlines this. There's a new branch of psychology called behavioral ethics, which was featured in a recent book by Professor Max Bazerman. And he talks in particular about how all of us can get ethically bounded, about how we can limit our vision about the action or decision we're about to take and not see the bigger picture. And he counsels caution as a result. And so the point I'm making about all of this really is to say that, when I saw the small payroll fraud, when I saw the expenses fraud, when I saw any number of frauds and wrongdoing over the years, we shouldn't be that surprised that they're happening. And we should remind ourselves and pinch ourselves that we're all vulnerable to making poor decisions from time to time. Over 25 years ago, we did a public survey to assist in identifying the vulnerability of our then social welfare system to fraud. And we found in the course of that really what Zimbardo found, which was that it's not a binary world of good and evil, but it's a continuous spectrum, and that all of us can cross the line to a smaller extent or to a greater extent. Who hasn't forgotten to put the money in the meter and not done anything about it? Small transgression. But from small things, bigger things grow. So if I've put some shape on how big the problem is, let's turn then to who should be doing something about it. And it's tempting thinking about legislation or the Office of the Ombudsman, and with all the references that have been made here tonight, that it's somebody else's problem. But actually, it's a problem for each and every one of us. It is, in fact, an imperative for all of us to do our piece, because it's when we don't that all the bad stuff happens. And it's quite remarkable, if I think of some of the frauds that I've investigated over the years, how many people knew something was wrong, but just didn't want to rock the boat or do anything about it. So in practical terms, what does that translate to? I think if I was to pick two topics, it would be to the tone of the top and to plain speaking. The tone of the top being so important, whether public or private, because that is what sends out the waves. In my experience, the formal policies and procedures might account for 95, 98, 99% of the expectations, but a single arch of the eyebrow can communicate more than all the written papers as to what's acceptable or objectionable, what's kosher or not. And these little signals can be sent out and set the tone enormously. And of course, it's the board and top management who are responsible in the first instance for that. But there's a plain speaking piece that actually I think we all need to reflect on as well. I'll give you a simple example. A friend of mine went for I'll keep it anonymous. He went to get a service of a particular type, which was to be available at 9 o'clock in the morning. He went at 8, and the individual who was delivering the service didn't come into work until 10 past 10, and they went off and had a cup of tea, and started at 20 to 11. And we had a chat about this, and he was really annoyed because he was trying to get in and out. He came in at 8 o'clock, and he wanted to get out quickly. And I said to him, well, did you challenge the individual? And he said, no, absolutely not, because I had to get this thing done and get out the door. But I said, in effect, isn't that theft? Now, that's a rude monosyllabic word, which most people wouldn't like, but somebody here was getting paid an hour and 40 minutes and delivering nothing for it. And of course, it's a bit unpopular to be calling things out quite that bluntly, but actually, isn't that what we need to do? Because if we don't call it out, then it will continue, it will get bigger, and we will tolerate it. So, on the who has to be concerned, I suppose I'm reminded of that wonderful 10-word sentence of 2-letter words. 10 words, all 2 letters. If it is to be, it is up to me. And I think it's a wonderful call for examining what our personal responsibility is in relation to this. So just to turn to the final, having dealt with how big the problem is and who should be calling it out, the third question is when. And of course, what John will tell us about in a little bit more detail is an extremely important part of when it should be called out. But if we were to rely solely on the Speak Up campaign, I think we all collectively would have failed monumentally. Because if it's only the Speak Up piece that brings it to light, that means that corporate governance has failed. That means that risk management has failed. That means that all of the independent assurance mechanisms, whether internal audit, external audit, regulatory oversight or whatever, it means they've failed too. Now, that's not to say that the speaking up isn't important. I think it's very, very important, and I really welcome it, because what it does is it sparks some dialogue and gets us thinking about how we make this work to best effect. And of course, the best way of making this work has to be getting back to that tone at the top. It has to be with leadership from those who are in power in organizations, whether private or public. It has to be in the plain speaking. It has to be in personal responsibility. But if those mechanisms don't work, then the mechanisms that we've heard about already this evening play a really important role. Because first of all, they provide a protection for the individual, and secondly, they provide a mechanism to bring to light the issues that need the bright light of transparency. And so on that note, I would like to welcome very much the initiative taken by Transparency Ireland and to wish John and his colleagues all the very, very best in its operation in the future. John.